Yes guys, what's happening? Welcome back to the channel. My name is Taylor, and in today's video what we'll be discussing is a look at sort of a deep dive into the goings on at Newcastle United, and specifically the management at Newcastle United. Basically between Steve Bruce and Rafa Benitez. With the recent sacking of Steve Bruce, there's been a lot of talk in media by a lot of ex-pundits comparing the two managers at Newcastle and sort of looking at the stats between the two and comparing them that way. And if you listen to the likes of sort of pundits and things like Gary Neville, Paul Scholes, who indicated that they thought that Steve Bruce should have been given more time and especially a go at the new investment that Newcastle United have got. And also people like Gary Bonghor on TalkSport, I heard, comparing stats between the two managers in the Premier League and sort of saying how they're very comparable, yet the Newcastle United fans treated both managers very differently. So what I'm going to be looking at is, are the Newcastle United fans justified in their opinions on Rafa Benitez and Steve Bruce, or did they treat Steve Bruce a bit too harshly? Basically, we're going to be doing that. We're going to be able to look at the complete direct comparison over the stats they've had in the Premier League. That includes Rafa's first 10 games in management in the 2015-16 season before they got relegated, and obviously Steve Bruce's last 8 games in the Premier League. I'm not going to be talking about anything they did previous management or anything like that. I'm also not going to be looking at Rafa Benitez's season in the Championship with Newcastle United. This is a direct comparison in the Premier League between the two managers, and looking at the transfers, and also I'm going to be looking at the quality of the squads and comparing them, because there's also been talk that Steve Bruce's squad has a lot of quality in it, and they should probably be doing slightly better than what they are doing now. So let's get into it. So this is the first thing we're going to be looking at here. This is the 2015-16 season. This is the season that Newcastle got relegated from the Premier League. And as you can see, for the final 10 games of that season, Rafa Benitez joined the club. So this is just basically a quick look at to see the impact that Rafa Benitez did make at the time. On the left-hand side here, you can see the statistics, before Newcastle were under Benitez. And you can see the points per game, goals scored per game, goals conceded per game, overall goals scored, goals conceded, and win percentage there on the left-hand side, and direct contrast to the right-hand side. And you can see a very big improvement under Rafa Benitez. But unfortunately, it wasn't enough to stop them getting relegated. But just a quick one: if Newcastle United fans only watch this, if you actually take the Rafa Benitez's numbers, and I know it's only for 10 games and it's not a direct science and you can't really do this, but if you were to multiply that and directly average that out across the entire season, it would have took them to around 50 odd points that season, which would have put them around 10th in the table at the time if Rafa Benitez had had that entire season and obviously managed to have those stats throughout that. That's not a direct science, but just an equivalent to see where they were going. You can also see that before Rafa Benitez joined the club, Newcastle United were an absolute freefall by the looks of the stats here, with only a 21% win percentage at the time, which is pretty horrific, really. But yeah, this is just a quick slide just to sort of to see where Rafa Benitez was when he joined the club into where he became afterwards. So this is Rafa Benitez's full stats in the Premier League, so including those final 10 games of that first season, and these are the 2 full seasons that he did have in the Premier League under Newcastle United. So you can actually see there, the points per game, you can see it wasn't quite the same, but at 1.3 to 1.2, the final 2 seasons he had, is pretty comparable. And you can see there that the goals scored per game, again, not as good as the first 10 games, but I think there's a pretty big reason for that. If you actually look at the squad that Rafa Benitez inherited at the time, it had the likes of Wijnaldum, Sissoko, and players like that at the time that obviously had left into that season that weren't available to him in the previous 2 seasons. So that's why, if you look at those stats there, the goals, you can see the goals scored were much higher that final 10 games of the season. But defensively, pretty comparable throughout the 3 seasons. Goals conceded per game, at 1.2 throughout this entire time, apart from this last season, which rose to 1.3. But if you actually look at the goals conceded numbers in the 17-18, 18-19 season, you can see they're pretty identical. 47 goals in the 17 season and 48 goals in the 18 season. And again, a pretty good win percentage there at 32%. And obviously, look, 44 points to 45 points, finishing 10th and 13th in those respective seasons. So this is actually quite interesting, because when we look at Bruce's numbers, we can actually see how comparable these really are. So this again is the Premier League stats under Steve Bruce for Newcastle United. Again, so the far right hand column is this season's stats that he had his final 8 games. Sorry, yeah, his final 8 games of the season, and obviously the 1920, 2021 stats of his full seasons at Newcastle United. Um, the first thing to note is here you can actually see if you actually down at the points, it's very remarkable, really, that he managed to get 44 points in his first season, the exact same as Rafa Benitez. And in his second season, he got 45 points, which was the exact same as Rafa Benitez. Um, so which is quite strange, really. And even though his positions in the Premier League were a little bit lower, he got 13th and 12th, and Rafa got 10th and 13th. So again, pretty comparable, really. Again, the only big difference here, if you actually look at his 2021 stats there, his win percentage was the same as Rafa's 2 full seasons in the Premier League. But again, his first season was a bit lower than what Rafa Benitez was as well. So yeah, this is just a quick overlay to see. You can also see his final season at Newcastle United manager was horrific statistically. You know, 19 goals conceded in 8 games is terrible. Yet to didn't record a win, only scored the 10 goals, and they were conceding 2.2 goals per game at the time that Steve Bruce was sacked, which is, do you know what I mean? They had no chance. Those stats continued. You know what I mean? That's relegation all the way when you look at it. Um, so yeah, you can also sort of see there that the actual comparisons, 1.2 points per game in the first 2 seasons, are pretty comparable to what Rafa Benitez was doing at the time, and things like that. So they're pretty comparable and pretty similar in that sense. But let's have a look when we directly compare them. So yeah, this is when those 3 stats, all those 3 tables, sorry, for each of those managers combined with a direct look at the complete side by side here that you can sort of give a comparison to. So what's actually quite bizarre is they both managed pretty much identical the same amount of games. They're for 86 games for Rafa Benitez and 84 games for Steve Bruce. Okay. Now again, when you look at the points per game, very similar. Rafa Benitez with 1.2, Steve Bruce with 1.1. Both had the exact same goals scored per game, which is 1.1 and 1.1. So identical there. However, the big difference on this table is the goals conceded per game. 1.2 for Benitez and 1.7 for Steve Bruce, which is massive. So basically, they're conceding an extra half a goal per game on average under Steve Bruce than they were Rafa Benitez. And that's highlighted there. They both managed almost the same amount of games here. So Steve Bruce managed 2 fewer games for Benitez, but conceded 32 more goals in that time, um, which is pretty remarkable, really. And that's also reflected at the top there, the total points under each manager. That Rafa Benitez, although he had 2 extra games, managed to get 10 more points. Average position very similar, 12th and 13th, which is also sort of incomparable to the points per game. But yeah, like I said, the main difference there, you can see the win percentage pretty similar, 31 for Benitez in total, 27 for Bruce. Again, massively brought down by his final stint at the club and this season's stats where he was sacked, because previously he sort of had averaged roughly similar to Steve Bruce's stats there. But again, the biggest takeaway from this graphic here, what you want to look at, is the goals conceded. And if you actually go back and look at the previous table, you can actually see that Steve Bruce's goals conceded was getting worse. And if you compare it to this season, he's conceded 19 goals in 8 games already, which means they would have absolutely blown past the previous record that he'd had. And if you look at Rafa Benitez's goals conceded was pretty similar year on year, whereas Steve Bruce was in the 40s, the 50s, and the 60s. And again, this season would have easily surpassed 60 if they had carried on at that rate they were conceding goals. Okay, so this is the next one. So as we can see, the stats were very similar, apart from defensively. Stats were very favourable to Rafa Benitez in that sense here. But this is a total look at the transfer market under the 2 managers. Um, and as you can see there, the breakdown there, how much money they spent each individual window and how much money was players they sold, really. At the very bottom there is the net spend. And at the very right hand table there, you can see that's the total time, the breakdown of the transfers under the managers at the time of the club. One big thing here is that obviously the 2021 season, Steve Bruce didn't have a January transfer window. So there would have been an extra transfer window into that that would have sort of moved these stats around a bit. But again, pretty comparable in the 2.5 seasons that they had. 2.5 seasons in the transfer window, sorry, without the January transfer window there. So the biggest thing to look at from here is, which I didn't realise, is that if you actually look at the total spend at the end here, Rafa Benitez actually outspent Steve Bruce, which from what I thought and when I look back at his time at Newcastle United, I honestly thought that he didn't get much money to spend. And I thought, oh, Steve Bruce would be given loads of money and Rafa Benitez got none. But if you actually look at it, that's actually not true at all. And when you look at the total spend there of 153 million under Rafa Benitez and 127 under Steve Bruce, the biggest difference here, as you can see on the net spend here, is massive, and that's the real issue here. When you look at it, although Rafa Benitez might have spent more, and again that is with one extra transfer window, the net spend difference is crazy. So they've pretty much managed the same amount of time. In fact, Benitez longer than Steve Bruce, especially, well, if you include the championship season. But for money spent, Newcastle United made money on transfers under Rafa Benitez. Now, a massive part of that is the very first transfer window. Obviously, that 90 million there you can see was the likes of Sissoko. I think Andros Townsend was in that as well, along with Sissoko. So Sissoko, Wijnaldum, and Townsend are the main bulk of that transfer window. But still, his entire time at the club, they made money on transfers. They had a positive net spend, which is remarkable, really. Um, and when you compare that to Steve Bruce, who had a minus 94 million net spend, 94.8, so 95 million net spend negative at Newcastle United in his tenure. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing, because if you look at most clubs, if you want to spend money and improve, you tend to buy in players that are worth more than the players you have in your squad. Therefore, your net spend tends to be negative. But the fact that Steve Bruce had a 95 million net spend negative and Rafa Benitez had a 2.3 positive is crazy. That's almost £100 million swing, which is crazy. So Rafa Benitez basically he spent what he made. So whatever he made for the transfer market, he then spent that into his team. Steve Bruce did the exact same thing, except he got an extra 95 million on top of what he made. So effectively, Steve Bruce was given an extra £95 million that wasn't afforded to Rafa Benitez, which is massive. I'm not sure why that is. I'm not sure if that's just happened to be the thing or what it is. But if you look at Steve Benitez, he did have relatively high transfer windows compared to Steve Bruce. Although Steve Bruce did have the biggest transfer window of 65 million in his first summer there, his first season there at the club. £100 million extra net spend is absolutely massive, and especially in today's market, that could be 3 or 4 brilliant players, which could have made a real difference to Rafa Benitez. But yeah, this was the biggest shock to me: almost £100 million swing in net spend between the two managers. So what this is a follow-on from that really is basically a look at the squads that were afforded to each manager really. And if you actually look at the breakdown of the squads, and you can go on transfermarket.com and you can look at the squads, it's a pretty big difference, really. First off, obviously, this season here, you look at Steve Bruce's people that he has there. The likes of Sir Maximum, Callum Wilson, Joe Willock. Good players, very good players in comparison. He also spent the £40 million on Joe Linton. Somehow he was worth £40 million. When you direct compare that to Benitez, his highest transfer was £20 million, which was Almiron that you can see there on the left-hand side. So half the price of Steve Bruce's major signing, and also there's a couple of other players that Steve Bruce and Rafa Benitez brought in there. Jose Perez, who obviously now is at Leicester City, was there when Rafa Benitez was there. I think was sold in the summer that Steve Bruce joined to Leicester City. He was sold there. Matt Ritchie, one of Rafa Benitez's big signings. I think he was brought in from Bournemouth for around £10 million, and he was one of Benitez's biggest signings. So you can sort of see the difference here, especially in quality of players that are coming through the door. And obviously, there's a couple of players there like Mitrovic there, who's a good striker, but not maybe at Premier League level. He's a good Championship striker. But again, when you compare the signings that Steve Bruce made and the quality of squads, Steve Bruce had a far greater squad. Callum Wilson, St Maximin, quality players, especially St Maximin. Joe Willock, who was a brilliant signing from Arsenal. So again, quality players in the squad. Not to mention £40 million they spent on Jollington that could have been spent elsewhere or on a better player for that sort of value. The fact that Steve Bruce spent the money that he did, he inherited Rafa's squad and then spent that much money on top of Rafa's squad and didn't really improve is a massive reason here in a massive part of the argument that not many people are taking into account when discussing the whole comparison between Bruce and Benitez. So that's basically it. That's the stats and statistics that are all supporting it. I think looking at the breakdown, I think the Newcastle United fans are completely justified in their opinions on Steve Bruce and Rafa Benitez. Because especially when you look at the team that Rafa Benitez inherited, the money that he was allowed to spend on a squad, the players that he brought in, the numbers that he was doing, and then Steve Bruce had that squad and added an extra 120 million on it, added to Rafa Benitez's squad the likes of St Maximin, Callum Wilson, Joe Willock, and ultimately didn't improve that squad. Statistically, they are very similar. But if you go back to that table that I discussed in the direct comparison, Rafa Benitez outperforms him, although ever so slightly. He outperforms him in every single category on that table there. So it's a big difference. The transfers is the biggest thing here. That it seems like Rafa Benitez was outperforming what his squad's capability was, and that Steve Bruce was underperforming it, considering what he added to the squad. Yeah, basically that's basically it. Really, my opinion is that with Rafa Benitez is what he did for the squad, the players that he had, the extra money that he wasn't given, and the fact that he still managed to outperform Steve Bruce is a massive thing. So the Newcastle United fans out there that I think they are completely justified in their wanting of Steve Bruce to be sacked. And the biggest problem I have with a lot of the people in the media, a lot of players were managed by Steve Bruce and say he's a really nice guy. And that's awesome, but that doesn't make him, just because you're a nice guy, doesn't make you a good manager. And I think the biggest problem is when people look at the Steve Bruce and things like that argument, if you look at the numbers, Newcastle United were getting worse. This season, their numbers are horrific. If that had carried on for the rest of the season, Newcastle United would be relegated by January. They'd be gone. So I find it very bizarre that he's being supported, even if you just looked at this season isolated from the previous time as manager at Newcastle United. It's very bizarre to me. So yeah, that's basically my thoughts on the whole situation. I'm not a Newcastle United fan. I'm actually a Man United fan. So if anything, I would have been in Steve Bruce's corner. But I don't really have a dog in the fight for this one. But yeah, I think the Newcastle United fans are completely justified in their opinion on Steve Bruce, and also why they're pretty annoyed at pundits in the media sort of backing Steve Bruce. I completely understand from looking at what we've seen here from why they've done it. So yeah, that was my look into Steve Bruce and the deep dive between Benitez and Bruce. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. If there's something on other tables or other stats that you would like to see, let me know in the comments below. This is my first time doing this sort of video, sort of comparing the stats and things like that. So let me know if you liked it. Again, if you want to see comparisons between anything in football or things like that, let me know in the comments below. I'd happily do a video on it. But yeah, let me know what you think. If you did like it, please do leave a like. And if you want to see videos like this in the future or things like this, then please do subscribe to the channel in the future. But until then, cheers for watching.